An officer bought an old German Shepherd for just $1, a dog no one wanted, too old, too broken, but the moment he looked into the dog's eyes, he froze. Those eyes. They belonged to a partner he buried years ago, or so he thought. Inside the dog's worn collar was a hidden tag, and a name he hadn't spoken since the night of the failed drug raid that changed everything. But what the dog led him to next, a hidden trail of secrets, a cover-up involving his own department, and a warehouse that smelled like meth, would shake the town to its core. And when he uncovered the truth behind his best friend's death, and the role this brave old canine had played all along, what happened next will restore your faith in loyalty, justice, and second chances. The rain came soft over Rocky Hollow, a small Colorado town pressed against the curve of the mountains, where mist clung to rooftops like faded memories, and the pine trees stood guard over narrow roads and forgotten names. It was late October. The air smelled of wet leaves, rust, and cold iron, the kind of morning where you saw your breath but not the road ahead. Sheriff Ben Carter, 39, sat behind the wheel of his county patrol truck, fingers tapping the steering wheel in quiet rhythm. Tall and broad-shouldered, Ben had the kind of build that suggested he'd once been an athlete, though now it was more functional muscle than vanity. His dark brown hair was short and beginning to gray at the temples, but it was his eyes that gave him away, steel blue, tired, and carved with the weight of things he rarely said aloud. Ben wasn't just quiet by nature. He'd become that way by grief. It had been nearly 3 years since Lucas Granger, his partner and best friend, died during a drug raid gone sideways. Since then, Rocky Hollow had changed. Or maybe Ben had. He'd stayed in uniform but stepped back from most field work, attended church funerals more than barbecues, declined invites, let people drift. He had no plans to stop this morning. He didn't need eggs or bread or feed. But as he drove past the farmer's market set up near the old mill, something made him pull over. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the shape in the rain, still and hunched, almost invisible. The makeshift market buzzed beneath canopies and flapping tarps. A boy sprinted by with a sack of apples, laughter trailing behind. Ben nodded politely at a vendor selling pumpkins, his badge catching a flicker of light. Then he saw it. Tied to the wooden post of an empty produce stall was a German Shepherd. Not just any dog. An old one gray streaked along the sable coat, patches of missing fur at the haunches, and a visible limp in the back right leg. Rain soaked its coat, matting it down to the ribs. Its head hung low, but its eyes were open, wide and staring. Not at the road, at him. There was a cardboard sign nailed to the post above the dog's head. $1. No name, no use. Ben's boots struck the mud with weight as he walked toward it. The crowd didn't notice. Or maybe they had, and they just didn't care. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark. It simply lifted its head, looked straight into Ben's eyes, and waited. A voice cut through the drizzle. "Hey, Mutt!" A teenage boy, no older than 15, wiry and too confident, kicked at a puddle near the dog. "Should have put you down, huh?" He moved as if to shove it. Ben was there in 2 steps. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "Step back." The boy hesitated, scowled, then muttered, "Whatever," and slinked off. Ben turned his attention back to the dog. For a moment, all he could do was stare. Those eyes. They were tired, yes, but there was a defiance behind them. Something wounded but unbroken. A thing that refused to die. Ben knelt. The dog didn't flinch. Up close, the damage was clearer, scars along the chest, a torn left ear, and a faint tattoo on the inside of the hind leg, barely visible through matted fur. Military? Maybe even K9, and something else, a faint indent around the neck where a thicker collar had once rested. No tags, no food, no blanket, just rain and resignation. Ben stood and turned toward the nearest vendor, an older woman in a red raincoat, watching silently. "Whose dog?" She shrugged. "Guy dropped it off an hour ago. Said he couldn't keep it. Thought someone might, I don't know, want it. Been there since. Nobody wants a dog that can't bark, can't fetch, hell, might be half blind. Did he leave a name? Nope. Just said, take it or shoot it. She frowned. Sorry. Ben didn't speak. He just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. He held it out. To the post, he said. The woman hesitated, then took it with a sad smile. You sure? I'm sure. He stepped back to the dog. You coming with me? No bark, no tail wag, just a slow, deliberate rise to all fours. The dog limped forward and stopped beside him. That was enough. Ben opened the back door of his patrol truck and helped the dog in gently. The old German Shepherd didn't resist. It settled down with a sigh, resting its head against the seat like it had done this before. He drove in silence, windshield wipers beating slow and steady. The station was a short ride away, a red-bricked building near the edge of town with peeling paint and a flagpole that always leaned slightly east in the wind. Ben pulled into the rear entrance and parked. As he opened the door, the dog hesitated. You're safe now, Ben murmured. Whatever they did, that's over. It stepped out. Inside the station's small garage, Ben dried the dog with an old towel, then led it to the storage room where he laid down a folded blanket and poured a bowl of water. The dog drank carefully, not frantically. Ben sat on the bench across the room, elbows on his knees, watching. After a long moment, he whispered, You remind me of someone. The dog turned its head and blinked. Slow. Intentional. Ben inhaled, the name catching in his throat. Lucas. And just like that, his chest tightened. The dog didn't react, but somehow the silence between them felt heavier. He stood and walked to his desk, pulled out a notepad, wrote one word, Shadow. He didn't know why he chose it. Maybe it was how the dog had appeared out of nowhere, silent yet full of history. Maybe because he didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The station was quiet that night. Rain tapped against the windows like a slow, forgotten song. The only sound inside was the soft huff of breath from the German Shepherd curled in the corner on the old army blanket Ben had laid down earlier. The dog's eyes were half closed, but not asleep, watching, always watching. Ben sat at his desk nursing lukewarm coffee, staring at the dog who now had a name Shadow. He hadn't chosen it lightly. There was something familiar in the way the dog moved, or didn't move, the way it watched with absolute stillness. In the flickering light of the desk lamp, Ben finally saw what his instinct had already told him. Shadow wasn't just any stray. This dog had a history, a story written in scars and silence. He set the mug down and crossed the room slowly, crouching beside Shadow. Gently, he reached toward the dog's neck. Shadow didn't growl, but the stiffening of muscles was clear. Ben paused, spoke softly. "It's okay, boy. Just checking something." At the base of the neck, beneath a patch of coarse fur, he found it, a small subcutaneous bump. Microchip. Ben stood and went to the evidence locker where they kept a handheld scanner for strays and rescues. The device beeped to life as he ran it over the spot. A soft chime, a match. The screen displayed a series of numbers and a name. Shadow, K9-241B. Handler, Officer Lucas Granger. Status, retired, deceased. Ben froze. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like seeing a ghost wearing fur. He stared at the screen, then back at the dog. Shadow looked back, unmoving. 3 years ago, Ben and Lucas had led a raid on a suspected meth lab out near the county line. It had gone wrong, ambush, gunfire, fire. Lucas was hit. Shadow had vanished in the chaos. The official report said the dog likely died in the blaze. But now... Ben sat heavily, mind racing. "How the hell did you make it out?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but there was something in the slow blink that felt like understanding. He grabbed his phone and hesitated before dialing a number he hadn't called in over a year. It rang twice. "Hello?" The voice was weary but composed. "Joanne, it's Ben." A pause. "Ben Carter? It's been a while." Joanne Granger had always been composed graceful in that way strong women carried grief. In her mid-30s, tall and lean with auburn hair usually pulled into a knot, she had once been a vet tech before tragedy pulled her out of everything familiar. Since Lucas died, she'd moved to a quiet edge of town and kept mostly to herself. "I wouldn't call if it wasn't important." "What's going on?" "It's about Shadow," he said. I think he's alive, and he's with me." Silence. "You're sure?" "I scanned his chip. It's him, Joanne. Same ID, same scars." Another pause, this time longer, then a shaky breath. "I looked for him," she said quietly, "after everything. Drove out there 3 times. Asked the department. They told me he died in the explosion. They told us both that." Ben leaned back in the chair. "Can you come down here? I'll be there in 15 minutes. True to her word, Joanne arrived just past midnight. She wore a raincoat too thin for the season and boots streaked with mud. Her face looked older than he remembered, not by age, but by weight. She stepped into the station and saw Shadow before she saw Ben. The dog rose slowly, limping slightly, tail low but not tucked. Joanne knelt. Shadow approached without sound. When his nose touched her hand, she broke. Her hand curled under his jaw, fingers finding the familiar notch of scar tissue near his throat. "Shadow, my sweet boy, it really is you." Ben watched silently, heart tight. She looked up. "How did you find him?" "He found me." They sat together for a while, talking softly while Shadow lay beside her, his breathing steady, eyes watching both of them. Joanne eventually asked the question Ben had been avoiding. "Do you think Lucas knew something before he died?" Ben nodded. "He left notes. I found some in his locker. Unofficial. Something about a second location, a different route. And Shadow? Lucas left a note saying if anything happened, Shadow would know." Joanne's face tightened. "You think Shadow's return is part of something bigger?" "I don't know," Ben said, "but I think someone didn't want him found." She nodded slowly. "He has something to tell us, even if he can't speak." Outside, thunder rolled low across the mountains. Ben walked Joanne to her car. As she opened the door, the headlights from an old black pickup truck suddenly appeared at the far end of the street. It slowed as it passed the station. No plates on the front. Ben narrowed his eyes. "That truck's been around here before," he murmured. Joanne looked up. "You sure?" Shadow stepped out from the garage door behind them and growled. A low, primal sound that Ben hadn't heard until now. The truck didn't stop, but it lingered just long enough to send a message before disappearing into the fog. Ben turned to Shadow, who stood firm, tail stiff, muscles tense. "Looks like you're not the only one with a past," Ben whispered. They went back inside, locking the door behind them, and, for the first time in a long while, Ben Carter slept with his badge on the nightstand and a loaded sidearm within reach. The morning broke gray over Rocky Hollow, the sky the color of ash and the mountains shrouded in a blanket of low-lying mist. There was no rain, only the kind of cold that slipped through jackets and whispered against your skin like it remembered something you didn't. Ben stood in his garage, hands shoved in his coat pockets, watching Shadow pace. The dog had started it before dawn, scratching softly at the old wooden door that led to the back storage space. Not frantically, not out of boredom, but with intent. Every few minutes, Shadow would return to the door, paw at it once, then sit and look at Ben. It wasn't normal behavior. Ben knew animal routines better than most. Dogs scratched at food bowls, barked at squirrels, whined to go out. This was different. This was direction. "All right," Ben muttered, stepping forward. "You've got my attention." He hadn't opened that part of the garage in months, not since last spring, when he cleared it out after a mouse infestation. The storage room itself wasn't large, just a concrete slab with old shelving, a rusted tool chest, and one heavy gray locker in the corner. That locker had belonged to Lucas. Ben had never gotten rid of it, never opened it either. After the funeral, Joanne told him she couldn't bear to look at it, so Ben brought it home, stuck it in the garage, and turned the key once to lock it. Then he never looked back. Now, Shadow was standing in front of it, tail still, ears alert, like a soldier waiting for orders. Ben retrieved the key from the hook behind the breaker box. His fingers trembled slightly as he inserted it into the lock. It turned with a faint click, and the door creaked open, stiff on old hinges. Inside were only a few items neatly placed. Lucas had always been that way. A green army-style field notebook, a folded piece of yellowed paper tucked into a Ziploc bag, and beneath it, a rolled map held together with a cracked leather strap. Ben pulled them out and carried them to his workbench. Shadow remained by the locker but shifted his gaze to follow Ben's movements. He opened the field notebook first. Inside were grid-lined pages covered in Lucas's familiar scrawl. Precise, clean, but deliberately vague. It wasn't a diary, it was a logbook. Coordinates, times, initials. A few entries marked with asterisks. One stood out. Sighting confirmed. Unmarked vans, near Dry Ridge. Shadow alert. Possible exchange. Ben frowned. Dry Ridge was near the northern border of Rocky Hollow, a stretch of state land mostly used for seasonal hunting. Not much law enforcement presence out there unless something went wrong. Ben flipped through more pages. The last entry was dated 3 days before the failed drug raid that killed Lucas. It read, "Cabin, same place, same time. If this goes bad, I pray someone picks up the trail." Ben looked up, then unfolded the yellow paper. It was a torn scrap from a larger page, but the handwriting was unmistakably Lucas's. Just a single line. "If I don't come back, Shadow knows where to go." Ben exhaled. Next came the map. It was topographical, dated at least 5 years prior. In red pen, Lucas had circled a small square on the far northeast edge near Dry Ridge. A hand-drawn arrow pointed to it. Cabin, Old Station 12. That name struck a chord. Station 12 had once been an old ranger's outpost back in the 70s, abandoned for decades. Ben remembered it from childhood stories about poachers, old moonshine trails, even ghosts. But Lucas had mentioned it once in passing, said he went camping near there, but Ben never thought twice about it. He looked at Shadow, who had sat quietly beside the bench now, watching every move. "You took him there, didn't you?" Ben said. "You and Lucas." Shadow didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, but he stood. Ben spent the next half hour gathering gear. A flashlight, maps, radio, thermal jacket. As he packed, he thought about whether to tell Joanne, but decided against it for now. There was no point giving hope until he knew what this really was. As he opened the garage door to leave, a voice called from across the yard. "Ben, you got a second?" It was Ray Hooper, the local mail carrier. In his 50s, Ray was a broad, thick-bellied man with a permanently windburned face and a voice that carried across rivers. He was the town's walking news bulletin, and one of the few people Ben trusted for raw information. Ray approached with a cautious smile and a manila envelope in hand. "This came through my office last night. No return address. But it's marked for your hands only. Figured I'd bring it by." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Did it come through sorting?" "Nope. Was sitting in the bin marked for downtown drop-off, not postmarked. Someone slipped it in." Ben took the envelope and opened it. Inside were 2 photographs. The first was grainy, taken from a distance, a photo of Shadow, chained in an alley, barely standing. The second was a snapshot of Ben himself, taken from behind as he locked the station door 2 nights ago. Nothing else, no note, no message. Ben's jaw tightened. Someone was watching, not just Shadow, him too. "Thanks, Ray," he said. Ray nodded, noticing the tension. "You all right?" "Not sure yet." He left shortly after, Shadow in the passenger seat of the patrol truck. They drove north, past the familiar trail markers and logging roads, into the part of the forest where even GPS gave up. The tires crunched through frost and leaves as they turned down the old fire lane. 20 minutes later, they reached the edge of Dry Ridge. Shadow stirred. Ben parked. They walked the last half-mile in silence, save for the wind in the pines and the occasional crack of a distant branch. At last, they saw it. A decaying cabin. slanted porch, one window boarded shut, another hanging loose. Faint tire tracks in the dirt, though partially erased by weather. Shadow stepped forward and paused. Then, tail raised slightly, he walked up the creaking steps and sat before the door. Ben followed, pulse tight in his throat. Something about this place felt too quiet. He placed a hand on the doorknob. It wasn't locked. And, as he pushed it open, the air inside greeted him like a breath held too long. The door creaked open under Ben's hand, revealing the dim interior of the cabin. Dust floated like ash through slats of pale light that pushed in from the broken window. The scent inside was a mixture of mildew, rotting wood, and the faint chemical trace of something acrid. The place hadn't been abandoned long enough for the smell to disappear, not completely. Shadow stepped inside first, moving low and deliberate. His ears were forward, nose twitching. The dog's movements changed, no longer cautious like entering a home, but methodical, like clearing a perimeter. Ben followed, stepping lightly onto the warped floorboards. The main room was cluttered an old metal cot, half collapsed in the corner, a rusted propane heater, broken crates, and scattered debris that might have once been boxes. Faint scratches on the wood near the back door caught Ben's eye. They were recent, and they weren't from animals. Shadow paused near the center of the room, head tilting sharply to one side. Then he barked. It wasn't a loud or random bark. It was one, low and directed. Ben crossed the room just as Shadow dug his front paws into a loose plank beneath the floor. His claws hooked under the edge and began to scrape. Ben knelt and pried the board up fully. Beneath it was a shallow compartment no more than 6 inches deep. Inside, wrapped in clear plastic and sealed with electrical tape, were 2 torn nylon bags, both lined with residue. One bag still bore a faint black Raven logo stamped in the corner. Ben's stomach dropped. Crow's Nest. The name had come up during old task force briefings. A regional meth distribution ring with suspected cartel ties, operating across multiple states. They were known for their precision and brutality, never leaving witnesses, rarely leaving evidence. The Raven logo was a mark used internally, never intended to be seen. If it was here, it meant this cabin had once been part of their operation. Ben placed the bags on the cot and pulled out his phone. He opened his encrypted note app and began photographing everything: the bags, the floorboard, the plank, the scratch marks, even the boot print near the entrance. Then he paused. The boot print. It was fresh. Ben crouched beside it. The heel pattern was still visible, the edges slightly smudged by the wind, but not enough. Someone had been here recently, possibly within the last day, possibly watching, and maybe they weren't gone far. He stood and scanned the corners of the room again. It was then he noticed a flash of silver duct tape peeking out from behind the heater. Carefully, he moved it aside and found another plastic wrapper, crumpled and stained, this time empty, but it bore the same Raven logo. And beside it, faintly etched into the drywall, were 3 initials: L.G. Lucas Granger. Ben reached out and touched the letters, fingers resting gently over the faded grooves. This was where Lucas had been. Not just investigating. He'd been involved in something deeper embedded, maybe even infiltrating, but no one ever said a word. None of it made it into official reports, which meant... Ben turned sharply toward the door. Someone had buried this. He stepped outside, cold air slapping his face. The wind had picked up, carrying flecks of snow as the sky began to shift from dull gray to white. It had started snowing, soft at first, but steady. The kind of snowfall that could erase tracks in minutes. Shadow emerged behind him and stood perfectly still, then growled. Ben followed his line of sight toward the tree line. Roughly 20 feet out, leading away from the cabin and into the deeper woods, were footprints. Not boot prints like his own, but smaller likely hiking shoes, perhaps unmarked. They were recent, shallow enough that the top crust of snow still sat within them. Whoever left them hadn't run, but hadn't been strolling either. Shadow moved forward, nose close to the trail. Ben followed, rifle now unslung and resting over his shoulder. They followed the tracks for 50 yards until they abruptly veered left and disappeared into the undergrowth where snow had gathered heavily. Ben crouched and brushed a branch aside. Nestled beneath was an old thermal scope lens, snapped off a larger unit. It had been left behind, either discarded in a hurry or dropped. Ben examined it and noticed a small engraving. Pineco. Pineco was a regional supplier based out of Denver, used mostly by law enforcement and private security firms. That narrowed it down. Ben pocketed the lens and turned to Shadow, who now stood at alert, tail up, but eyes locked on something. A figure was moving through the trees, fast and low, too far for a clean ID. Ben raised his weapon. "Stop! Sheriff's Department! I see you!" But the figure disappeared behind the ridgeline, leaving nothing but the hush of snow and the faint scent of burnt fuel. They were being watched. Ben and Shadow returned to the cabin, sealed the bags back inside the floorboard for now, and exited. He'd come back with a team. Right now, they had to leave before whoever had been watching decided to circle back. As they reached the patrol truck, Ben stared out into the trees, heart pounding. Lucas had known, and someone had made sure his silence lasted. The moon hung low over Whetstone, barely peeking through heavy clouds that loomed over the ridgeline like a warning. The snow from earlier had melted into slush, mixing with the grit of the town's edges, alleyways, rusted fences, and quiet warehouses that hadn't seen honest business in years. Sheriff Ben Carter leaned against his truck, parked in the shadows of a derelict storage yard on the eastern edge of town. Shadow sat beside him, ears twitching with every shift of wind, his muzzle still bandaged from the scratch he'd picked up near the cabin. The old German Shepherd was steady, focused, but Ben could feel it. He was on edge. They were both waiting. Earlier that week, Ben had tailed the same black pickup truck that had parked near his home. Its plates were fake, clearly swapped, and its route had led to a warehouse that was supposed to be under city management, but had long been leased out under questionable contracts. Tonight, it came again. Same low hum. Same dent on the left side of the bumper. Ben had taken a risk 2 nights ago, crawling beneath its chassis in an alley behind O'Malley's diner to attach a GPS tracker. The underside reeked of burnt rubber and ammonia meth production. He'd sent the tracker data to a secure FBI server through his old contact, Dean Wallace, but whoever was driving the truck was more careful than he'd expected. Now they waited for it to show again. Shadow suddenly stood. Ben followed his gaze headlights. The black pickup rumbled around the corner, slowed, then reversed into a warehouse bay, vanishing behind the rusted door. Shadow gave a low growl, subtle and controlled. Ben reached for his phone and opened the GPS app. Nothing. The tracker had gone dark. He cursed under his breath. He started toward the warehouse entrance, circling around a stack of pallets when he heard the door click open. A man emerged, tall, thin, mid-40s, unshaven, and wearing a battered hunting jacket. A cigarette glowed at the edge of his lip. He didn't see Ben. He walked toward a power box, unlocked it, and flipped a hidden switch. A second man stepped out next, bald, stocky, younger. His stance was military, controlled. They spoke briefly, then disappeared inside again. Ben pulled back. He couldn't go in alone, not without backup. Just as he turned to retreat, a soft sound broke the silence. A whimper. Ben spun around. Shadow had collapsed beside the truck, legs shaking. His body convulsed, tongue lolling to the side. Foam gathered at the edge of his mouth. "No, no, no, Shadow!" Ben dropped to his knees. He saw it then, a piece of meat, thrown near the tire, laced with something. He grabbed Shadow's mouth, trying to clear it. His heart pounded as he pulled out his emergency vial-activated charcoal, crushed. He pried Shadow's jaws open and forced it in. Shadow writhed. Ben carried the 80-pound dog to the backseat of his truck and sped to the only place still open past midnight Jensen's vet clinic, run by a former Army medic. The vet, Dr. Carla Jensen, was in her early 50s, silver-streaked ponytail, sun-worn skin, and eyes that had seen more than most battlefield medics. She didn't ask questions when Ben burst through the door. She simply pointed to the table. "What did he eat?" "Not sure. Possibly meth-laced meat. He was fine until 5 minutes ago." Dr. Jensen worked fast fee fluids, sedative, stomach lavage. Her hands were steady, movements precise. "Stay with me, boy," Ben whispered, holding Shadow's paw. An hour later, Carla stepped back and exhaled. "He's tough. The poison didn't fully absorb. You caught it in time. He'll be weak for a few days, though. Monitor his breathing. No stairs, no exertion." Ben nodded, his throat dry. They knew we were watching. Back home, Shadow curled into his bedding in the corner of Ben's small living room, breathing slow but steady. The next morning, Ben received a call. It was Joanne, Lucas's widow. She hadn't spoken much since their last conversation, but today her voice was tight. "I remembered something," she said. "Lucas told me once, just before he died, that he was going to file a report. He said something wasn't right. But then—" He stopped. I asked him why. He said someone paid a visit, that they knew where I lived. That's when Shadow disappeared. Ben clenched the phone. He was silenced. There was a pause. "Ben, if they knew about Lucas, they'll know about you too." Ben hung up and stared at Shadow, who stirred at the sound of his voice. His eyes were tired but alert. That look of defiance was still there, even in weakness. Later that afternoon, Ben was walking back to his truck outside the town's food bank when a man waved him down. The man was in his 60s, layered in coats that didn't match, beard streaked gray and brown. He leaned heavily on a crooked cane. His name was Eli, one of the town's homeless, known for being both paranoid and strangely observant. "Sheriff," Eli rasped, "I seen that truck of yours sniffing around the East Side warehouse." Ben hesitated, then nodded. Eli stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know the old ranger station up on Hollow Ridge?" "Yeah." "They're using it. Black truck's been up there 3 times in the last week. I was camped near the creek. Saw 'em unloading stuffed crates, covered in tarp." "You sure?" "I might not have a roof, but I got eyes." Ben considered him a long moment. Eli's eyes were bloodshot, but steady. "If you're right," Ben said, "you just might have saved lives." Eli scratched his beard. "I ain't looking for thanks, but if you could bring me one of those powdered donuts next time, I wouldn't be mad." Snow had returned to Whetstone by the following morning, frosting the town in a thin, crystalline glaze. The pines that ringed the hills surrounding the valley bowed under the weight of it, and the roads were quiet, muffled beneath soft powder. Sheriff Ben Carter stood at the edge of his porch, phone pressed to his ear, his breath forming ghostly puffs in the cold morning air. Inside the house, Shadow rested near the wood-burning stove, his breathing steadier now, his coat slightly dull from the prior night's ordeal. The call finally connected. "Dean Wallace," came a gravelly voice from the other end. "Dean, it's Ben Carter, Whetstone." A brief pause. "Ben, Carter, Lucas's friend." "Yeah," Ben said. "I need to talk. About something he might have sent you, something big. Something that went missing." Dean Wallace had been with the FBI for nearly 2 decades, and though officially semi-retired, he still ran a consulting office out of Spokane. He was black, tall and thick-shouldered, with a stern face and slow, deliberate way of speaking, like each word was weighed before release. Lucas had once called him the only man he trusted to know the whole deck. What kind of something? "Trout Hollow Ranger Station," Ben said quietly. "I think it was being used as a meth stash point. Lucas filed a report. The evidence disappeared." Another long pause. "I remember that," Dean said. "He called me 3 days before he died. Said he had GPS logs, photos, everything. I told him to send it through official channels. He did. But it's gone now, isn't it?" "Yes," Dean admitted. 2 weeks after the incident, the internal case file was marked as reclassified. I was pulled off. I thought Lucas gave up or panicked. But you're telling me he didn't." "He didn't give up," Ben said. He was silenced. Dean exhaled. "Where are you calling from?" "My home office. Don't use that line again. I'll reach out secure. Tonight, 9 p.m. Check your signal jammer and encrypt your Wi-Fi. If this goes where I think it does, we're stirring a hornet's nest." Ben hung up and turned to Shadow, who'd been watching him quietly. "Lucas was right," he murmured, "and they buried it." That evening, as dusk fell over Whetstone and the air turned sharp, Shadow limped toward the garage and began to whine softly. Ben followed him, flashlight in hand. The garage was cluttered, half storage, half memory. Lucas's old workshop tools still sat on a shelf covered in dust. Shadow sniffed along the northern wall, then stopped and began pawing at a particular plank beneath an old utility shelf. Ben knelt down, shining his light on the area. The plank was slightly warped, and beneath it was a gap just wide enough for a hidden compartment. He reached inside. A plastic bag. Inside, a cracked GPS device, mud-stained but intact, and a folded piece of paper. Ben turned it over. Lucas's handwriting. "Lost in the system. Not in the woods. If I go down, find where the signal stops." Ben plugged the GPS into his laptop. It flickered once, then began to load. The coordinates ended near Trout Hollow, but just past it, somewhere off the main trail. He pulled up a digital map, overlaid it with the GPS path. There was a clearing northeast of the station where the forest thickened and few ever ventured. No structures were listed. That's where it stopped. Ben was about to grab his coat when a knock came at the door. It was Eli. He wore a faded wool coat, a scarf made from stitched-together flannel shirts, and he smelled faintly of gasoline and campfire. His eyes were sharp, alert. "I told you I'd keep watch," he said, "and I remembered something else." Ben opened the door wider. "There's an old water silo, southeast edge of town," Eli said. "Used to be part of the Rangers' fire management line, abandoned since the 80s. After that raid, the one where Lucas vanished, I saw that dog," he nodded toward Shadow, "running from that direction, muzzle bloody, limping." Ben's gaze narrowed. "You're sure?" "I was camped near the quarry, saw it clear as day. No one believed me then, said I was seeing things." Ben looked down at Shadow. "You've been trying to tell me this the whole time." He grabbed his flashlight and coat. "Show me." The silo was overgrown, half sunken in brush, covered in graffiti and moss. It loomed against the evening sky like a forgotten relic of war. As they approached, Shadow's ears perked. His tail stiffened. He let out a soft growl. Inside, the concrete echoed their steps. A rusted ladder descended into a hatch that led below ground. Ben paused. "Stay up here," he told Eli. Then to Shadow, "Come." They climbed down. The air was damp, still. The walls were lined with rot and old pipework, but deeper inside was something newer footprints. Recent. Shadow barked sharply, sniffing along the wall. He stopped and sat beside a slab of broken cement. Ben knelt. Another hidden compartment. Inside, an old army satchel. Lucas's. Inside the satchel was a waterproof envelope. And inside that, photos. Stamped, dated, methamphetamine crates, license plates, faces. One of them was a face Ben knew well. Deputy Arnold Finch. Late 30s, white, buzz cut, heavy-set, always had a drawl in his voice and a joke for every situation. He had been Lucas's colleague, too. But Ben had always found him a little too friendly. Too easy with excuses. Too dismissive of leads. And now, here he was in a photo, standing beside a pallet of drugs, gun slung across his back, smiling. Shadow let out a low growl. Ben's fists clenched around the satchel. He turned to Shadow. "You were trying to finish his work," he whispered. "Alone." The sky over Whetstone turned the color of old bruises by noon, thick clouds rolling in with the warning hiss of an approaching storm. A sharp wind whipped along the ridge, stirring the brittle leaves and rattling the tin rooftops in town. Sheriff Ben Carter stood beside the old grain warehouse at the eastern edge of town, hidden beneath the rusted awning, his coat pulled up tight, eyes scanning the surrounding lot. Dean Wallace, bundled in a long black overcoat, stood a few feet behind him. The FBI agent had driven in from Spokane at dawn, his arrival unannounced and his demeanor even grimmer than Ben remembered. Dean was a man in his early 50s, tall and broad, with a salt and pepper beard and deep-set brown eyes that rarely blinked. His every move was deliberate, the weight of too many undercover operations etched into the lines around his eyes. He carried a worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder and a sidearm hidden beneath his coat. No words were wasted between him and Ben. They operated in silence now, both knowing too well how sound could betray the living. Through a set of long-range binoculars, Ben watched the southern entrance of the warehouse. "There," he muttered, handing the binoculars to Dean. "Same truck. Third time today." Dean observed for a moment, then nodded. "Black Ford. Same partial plate as last night, and it always backs into the loading dock. Never pulls forward." They had set up the surveillance post in a rented U-Haul truck parked beneath the pine trees, camouflaged with a thin mesh tarp and patches of dirt. Inside were radio jammers, heat-sensing scopes, and 2 thermoses of bitter gas station coffee. Dean had insisted they go low-tech, no surveillance drones, no tapping into street cams. "Too many years in the system," he had said. Ben adjusted the headset on his collar. "Shadow's in the back of the cruiser. If anything goes sideways—" "He'll hear it," Dean finished. "That dog knows more about these bastards than half your department." Shadow had been recovering well since the poisoning, though the wound on his leg still slowed him. But the old German Shepherd was restless, and when Ben opened the cruiser's rear gate that morning, Shadow jumped out without prompting, standing guard beside the truck like he'd never been injured. At 3:40 p.m., the static in the earpiece cracked. Dean stiffened. "We've got chatter." A muffled voice came through, laced with interference. "Load it tonight. Back up in place. No delays, storm or not." Ben scribbled on the notepad. "Tonight, early, confirmed." Dean responded quietly into the mic. "Understood. Tracking." Suddenly, the back of the warehouse flared with motion. 2 men stepped out, one in a dark green parka, the other wearing a knit mask and gloves. The second man raised a phone, pointed it toward the trees, then held it steady. Ben's stomach dropped. "They're scanning," he whispered. Before Dean could respond, the side door of the warehouse burst open and a third figure charged out, flanking them. "Move!" They dove behind the U-Haul, shots rang out, bullets tearing through the tarp. Ben rolled to the side, drawing his weapon, returning fire as Dean launched a flashbang toward the rear alley. The explosion disoriented their attackers, but one managed to get close. A masked man tackled Ben from behind, slamming him hard into the snow-packed ground. The man's gloved hand went for Ben's holster, but Ben held firm, struggling under the weight. That's when a sharp growl ripped through the air. Shadow. The German Shepherd launched from behind the parked cruiser like a storm wind, his coat streaked with mud, mouth bared. He collided with the attacker, teeth sinking into the man's arm, dragging him off Ben. The masked man screamed, trying to shake the dog loose, but Shadow held tight, biting hard until the man dropped his knife and scrambled away. Ben staggered to his feet, eyes wide. "Shadow back!" The dog obeyed instantly, limping slightly, muzzle smeared with blood, but his eyes alert and fixed on the fleeing man. Dean pulled Ben up. "You okay?" "Yeah, thanks to him." Shadow's left front leg bled again. He'd torn the stitches from his earlier injury. Ben knelt to inspect it, fingers trembling. "You stubborn old dog," he whispered. Later that night, back at Ben's cabin, the 3 of them regrouped. Dean set up a secure channel to FBI headquarters using a satellite phone. "We got partial IDs from the warehouse surveillance. Nothing solid, but enough to get the Bureau's attention," he said. Ben leaned over the table, hand on Shadow's back. The dog rested against his leg, eyes half closed but still alert. "What about the shipment?" Ben asked. Dean turned grim. "Intercepted radio confirmed. Large meth transport, 48 hours. Then everything moves." Ben nodded slowly. Joanne arrived an hour later. She wore a gray wool coat and a black knit cap, her blonde hair tied in a loose bun. The years had softened her once stern face, but her voice was firm. "I've been watching the warehouse for 2 nights now," she said. "I wrote down every plate I could see." She handed over a wrinkled notepad. "Most are local, but 3 have temporary tags, all untraceable." Ben looked up at her. "Why are you helping now?" Joanne's eyes flicked to Shadow. "Because Lucas would have never stopped, and because I saw someone in town today, Finch, and he looked right at me like he already knew I'd talk to you." She paused. "And that scares me." Shadow stirred beneath the table, letting out a soft growl. Dean looked over. "Smart dog." Joanne's voice lowered. "I think someone's watching me. My back window was cracked this morning. Nothing taken. Just open." Ben exchanged a look with Dean. "Time's up." The snow was falling in thick, wet clumps when Ben parked his cruiser in front of the federal field office set up just outside Whetstone. The pine trees were coated in white. The windows steamed from the warmth inside. Shadow sat in the back seat, his muzzle dusted with frost, his eyes alert despite the lingering soreness in his leg. Dean Wallace had called them in urgently. There had been movement in the case, but the final blow still hung in the balance. Inside the mobile command unit, a cluster of agents hovered around a map littered with red pins and marked photographs. The air was tense, thick with the scent of stale coffee and wet wool. Dean stood near the whiteboard, his arms crossed, a look of cautious resolve on his face. "Everything is in place," he said as Ben stepped in. "But we're stuck." Ben raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Dean turned to him and spoke in a lowered tone. "We know the drop's happening tonight. We have thermal scans, partial license plates, even radio chatter. But the judge won't greenlight the raid without irrefutable evidence. Something that links Harold Crane directly to the warehouse operation." Ben's expression darkened. "Harold Crane? The old sheriff?" Dean nodded. "Your predecessor. Lucas suspected him years ago, but nothing ever stuck. Too clean. Too quiet." Ben took a slow breath. Harold Crane had always seemed like a fixture of the town's stoic, deeply respected, now supposedly enjoying retirement in his farmhouse near the lake. Tall and burly with silver hair and a square jaw, Harold had been known for his firm handshake and conservative views. He commanded silence when he entered a room, but beneath that calm exterior was a man who knew every backroad and blind spot in Whetstone. Lucas had once confided in Ben about his unease with Harold's past, but with no solid leads, the suspicion had withered in silence. Dean walked to a side table, retrieved a portable audio player, and pressed play. A scratchy recording filled the room. "Get it loaded by sunset. Use Route 14. Avoid the main road. No mistakes. Understood?" The voice was low and gravelly, with a southern twang that curled around each syllable. Shadow, still lying at the threshold, stiffened. His ears twitched, and then he let out a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't random, it was recognition. Ben and Dean locked eyes. Dean clicked off the recording. "That's what I thought." He knelt beside Shadow and opened a leather folder. Inside were printouts of audio analysis logs from Lucas's old case files. One section had been redacted. Another showed frequency comparison with Harold Crane's recorded testimony from an unrelated town hall session. Dean flipped through the documents. "We ran voice-matching software," he said. 92% certainty, but that won't be enough for a warrant." Ben narrowed his gaze. "We need something physical, tangible, something that even Harold's badge can't erase." That's when Shadow nudged Ben's thigh with his nose. The dog's muzzle was pressed against the small of Ben's coat, pawing lightly at the hidden pocket. Ben reached down. His fingers closed around a familiar object and the worn leather collar that Lucas had clipped back onto Shadow the night before the final raid. It had never been removed. Shadow still wore it when Ben found him, though he'd replaced it during recovery with a medical version. Now, something inside it jostled under his fingers. Ben's eyes widened. He pulled the collar apart along the seam, and a tiny black USB fell into his palm. Dean leaned over, blinking. "You're kidding me." Ben shook his head slowly. "Lucas must have planted it on him before that night. Insurance." They plugged it into the FBI laptop. A folder appeared. Whetstone Aya Pi Lucas K-Nane. Inside were surveillance videos, grainy clips filmed through cracks in walls and hidden windows. One clip showed crates being unloaded at night in the warehouse. Another showed two officers, one of them clearly recognizable as Deputy Finch hauling large duffel bags. But the final clip was the gold mine. Harold Crane. He stood inside the warehouse wearing his old sheriff's badge and barking instructions at two masked men. Though the footage was from the side, his profile was unmistakable. "Rotate the shipment. Leave the rest at the water tower," he said. "If the boy's GPS is still transmitting, ditch the dog." Dean stared stunned. "That's more than enough." Ben's jaw clenched. He knew Shadow had a GPS, and Lucas was likely listening. That's why they set the trap. Dean copied the file to 2 drives. "This will get us the raid warrant." And with Shadow as part of the evidence chain, his reaction to Harold's voice can be recorded as behavioral confirmation. Ben looked at the old German shepherd beside him, who now sat tall, chest heaving gently, eyes fixed on the screen. There was something noble in that scarred muzzle, something unspoken, like he, too, had waited for justice far too long. That afternoon, Joanne returned to the cabin. She carried a small cardboard box. "I was going through Lucas's stuff again," she said, her voice hushed, "and I found this tucked in an old Bible in the attic." Inside the box was a medal, the K9 Valor Commendation. It had Shadow's old badge number on the back. "I think he was going to give it to Shadow the day after the raid," Joanne said softly. "He told me once, 'If I don't come home, make sure someone honors him.'" Ben took the medal in his hand. The medal was cold and heavy, but the weight felt right. Dean's phone buzzed. He answered, then nodded. "Judge approved the warrant. We move at midnight." As they left the cabin, Ben clipped the collar back onto Shadow. He knelt to the dog's level and whispered, "You ready, partner?" Shadow responded with a quiet woof and nudged Ben's hand, his eyes burning with quiet purpose. The warehouse raid took place under a moonless sky, the only illumination coming from the sharp beams of federal floodlights and the cold shimmer of snow reflecting off black tactical gear. Shadow stood at Ben's side, harnessed and alert, his body tensed but unwavering. The scar on his hind leg pulsed faintly with each breath, a quiet echo of battles survived. Dean Wallace stood by the FBI van, voice low and firm through the headset. "All teams in position. No one moves until my signal." Ben adjusted his vest and glanced down at Shadow. "You okay, old man?" he whispered. Shadow's eyes flicked up, calm and ready. At precisely 07:01, Dean gave the word. The operation unfolded in swift, calculated silence. Teams breached the entrances from the north and south. Flashbangs detonated behind thick steel doors. Shouts erupted inside, some defiant, others confused. 2 armed men attempted to flee through the eastern loading dock, but were tackled and cuffed before reaching the tree line. Ben moved through the center aisle, his sidearm drawn. Stacks of crates, mislabeled as gardening equipment, lined the walls. The scent of meth, fuel, and fear was thick. A door slammed at the far end. Ben rushed forward. Inside a back office, Harold Crane was burning papers in a barrel stove, his flannel shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold. He turned sharply when the door burst open. "You!" Crane growled, nostrils flaring. "You've got no idea what you're doing, boy." Ben didn't flinch. "I think I do, and so did Lucas." Shadow stepped forward and barked once loud, clear, and full of memory. Crane hesitated, a flicker of something guilt, maybe crossing his weathered face, but it vanished quickly. He reached for a drawer. Shadow lunged, slamming into Crane's arm just as the older man gripped a pistol. The weapon clattered to the floor. Ben was on him in seconds, cuffing him with practiced precision. "It's over," Ben said simply. Crane was dragged out in silence, his boots crunching in the snow, his pride shattered under the gaze of the badge he once wore. A week later, the snow had melted into soft mud, and Whetstone began to breathe again. The town square was filled with folding chairs, rows of flags, and people bundled in scarves. A small podium had been erected beside the statue of a miner, now temporarily adorned with a simple banner, "In memory of Officer Lucas Kent and K9 Shadow, for service beyond duty." Ben stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands folded. Shadow sat beside him, wearing a new harness embroidered with gold thread. The medal gleamed at his chest, polished and heavy. K9 Valor Commendation. It matched the one Joanne had found, now pinned on a velvet board behind the podium. Joanne stepped forward next, now wearing a deep green coat and leather gloves. Her voice was quiet but resolute as she addressed the town. The lines on her face, once hardened by grief, seemed softer today. Lucas believed in doing the right thing even when it meant standing alone. But he wasn't alone. Shadow was with him, and so was the truth. Applause rippled gently through the gathered townsfolk. From the crowd, Eli raised a hand and spoke up, his voice raspy but warm. The former drifter now wore a knit hat and held a carved cane. His appearance was still rugged, but there was a pride in his bearing that hadn't been there before. "That dog saved lives," he said. He kept Lucas's trail warm until someone cared enough to follow it. After the ceremony, Ben was called aside by a federal representative who offered him a commendation and a promotion. Liaison officer to state intelligence. Ben politely declined. "Thanks," he said, "but I've got something else in mind." 3 months later, on the outskirts of Whetstone, a new sign stood freshly painted beside a converted barn with steel fencing and warm wooden walls. Lucas House, Center for Retired Canines and Training Facility. The facility was simple but functional clean kennels, training yards, a heated recovery wing. Inside the main office, framed photos of Lucas and Shadow adorned the entry wall. Ben had traded his badge for denim jackets and gloves. His hair had grown a bit longer, and he carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd made peace with his past. Shadow was never far, always nearby, padding silently between buildings or lying at the base of the porch, head resting on his front paws. Joanne had taken on the role of co-director. Her days were now filled with medical supply orders, scheduling volunteer vet visits, and calling retired handlers from across the state. She was often seen at sunrise walking the gravel path behind the barn, coffee in hand, her gaze both watchful and content. One wall in her office bore pinned notes from letters Ben had received veterans who'd lost their dogs, officers unsure what to do next, teens interested in working with animals. But perhaps the most beloved presence at Lucas House was Eli. He had taken to calling himself the unofficial historian, and his stories, often half-true and always entertaining, became a daily ritual for new trainees and dogs alike. Shadow once sniffed out a crate of meth buried under 2 feet of manure, he'd say, puffing his chest. Didn't even flinch. He sat cross-legged beside new cadets' young handlers just entering the force. His hand always rested on Shadow's back as he spoke, and the dog would tolerate the attention with royal patience. Shadow had slowed down now. His steps were stiffer, and the scar on his leg flared up on colder mornings. But his eyes still shone, sharp and deep, like he remembered everything: the gunfire, the betrayal, the dark cabins and long walks. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 arrived with his father, a veteran struggling with PTSD. The child knelt beside Shadow, holding a handmade collar tag painted in red and blue. "What's his name?" the boy asked. Eli smiled. "Shadow. And he's the reason this place exists." The boy gently clipped the tag beside Shadow's medal. It read, "Thank you for staying." Ben watched from the porch, his heart full. The wind that morning whispered through the pines like a lullaby, brushing softly against the weathered beams of Lucas House. The frost clung to the window panes in delicate filigree, and a faint hush blanketed the yard as if the world itself had chosen silence to honor something sacred. Ben stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of black coffee, his dark flannel shirt buttoned up to the neck, worn jeans tucked into old boots. His face had aged a little more in the past few years, not from time, but from experience. Lines carved by pain, by healing, and by the weight of memory. Shadow lay at his usual spot near the porch steps. The 10-year-old German Shepherd was slower these days. The silver streaks in his sable coat now faded into a soft, ghostly gray. His body, once a taut spring of strength, had settled into a peaceful stillness. One bent ear twitched slightly at Ben's footsteps, and his tail thumped once against the porch. He wasn't asleep. Not yet. "Morning, buddy," Ben said quietly, sitting down beside him. His hand reached out to rest on Shadow's thick ruff, fingers curling slightly. "Cold today, huh?" Shadow blinked once, his eyes cloudy but still reflecting a deep and steady soul. He didn't move otherwise. He didn't have to. Presence was enough. Ben held an envelope in his other hand. The paper was soft with age, edges worn. He'd found it years ago, tucked behind a drawer in the old filing cabinet Lucas used to keep locked in his patrol cabin. He hadn't had the heart to read it until last night. He unfolded the letter slowly, voice low as he began to read. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back, and I'm sorry for that. But if there's anyone I trust to pick up the leash and finish what we started, it's you." Ben paused, his throat tightening. The cold air wrapped around them both like a silent witness. "Shadow's not just a canine. He's a compass. He'll lead you to what matters, even when you don't know where to go. If I fall, let him guide you. Let him remind you why we do this." Ben exhaled shakily, folding the paper and tucking it into the inner pocket of his jacket. He looked over at the old shepherd again. Shadow's breathing was calm, slow. The door creaked open behind them. A boy's voice spoke up gently. "Sir?" Milo stood in the doorway, hesitant. He was 12, small for his age, with a mop of red curls and a perpetual streak of grease on his cheek from helping with kennel repairs. The boy had arrived at Lucas' house just a month ago, dropped off by a social worker with little more than a backpack and a scarred past. He'd hardly spoken that first week, but something about Shadow had cracked through the shell. The boy followed the dog everywhere, feeding him, brushing his coat, sitting beside him for hours. The bond formed in silence, one broken soul recognizing another. Milo held something in his hands now, a collar he'd spent the past week making from scrap leather and brass. His fingers shook slightly as he approached, and he knelt beside the sleeping dog. "I made this for him," he said softly. "It's not perfect, but—" Ben watched as Milo gently slid the new collar over Shadow's neck. The tag, shaped like a small shield, bore the words, "The One Who Found Us." Shadow stirred slightly at the motion. His tail brushed Milo's knee. "Thank you," Ben said, placing a hand on Milo's shoulder. The boy nodded but didn't speak again. He remained there, kneeling beside the dog, his face lowered in quiet reverence. Later that afternoon, people gathered inside the main hall of Lucas' house. A few volunteers, some old officers, a pair of retirees from the neighboring town who had recently donated a pair of canine pups. The room was filled with warmth blankets draped over couches, walls lined with framed photos of dogs past and present. Ben stood before them, a plank of polished cedar in his hands. Upon it, freshly carved, were the words he'd etched that morning. "Not all heroes wear uniforms. Some wear fur." He mounted it on the central beam above the entrance to the kennel wing. As he stepped back, the quiet clapping of hands and sniffles filled the room. Joanne, now in her mid-50s, stood beside Eli. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a bun, and her eyes glistened behind her glasses. Eli, grizzled as ever, clutched a thermos of soup and muttered, "That mutt always knew how to find trouble and lead us out of it." Shadow's favorite blanket had been folded on the floor beside the fire. Though he hadn't moved from the porch much lately, Ben had carried him inside that evening. The old shepherd had been given a soft bed by the window, where the breeze could still carry in the scent of pine and snow. That night, as the wind died and frost began to form on the glass, Ben sat beside Shadow for hours, just watching the stars blink awake. The room was still, the only sound the occasional crackle of the fire. When the morning came, the sun breaking over the ridgeline like a gentle hand, Shadow did not stir. He was lying just as he had been, peaceful, eyes closed, his collar glinting in the gold light. His chest no longer rose and fell. Ben stayed with him a while, head bowed, until Milo quietly entered with a blanket and knelt beside them. Together, they wrapped Shadow in the fabric, gently and without hurry. Outside, the flag at Lucas' house was lowered to half-staff. The bells above the porch chimed once in the wind, as if to mark the moment. Shadow's resting place was beneath the large oak tree beside the training field. A smooth stone marked the spot, with a carved paw print and the inscription, "Shadow, the one who found us." Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends them with fur, a bent ear, and eyes that know your soul. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was a guide, a protector, a silent witness to both pain and healing. Through his loyalty and quiet courage, he led Ben and all of us toward truth, justice, and hope. This story reminds us that miracles don't always arrive with fanfare. They often walk quietly beside us, watching, listening, waiting for the moment we need them most. In the darkest of nights, God can speak through the bark of a dog, the warmth of companionship, or the echo of a friend long gone. So, if you believe that there are still unseen forces of good in this world, whether from above or on four paws, take a moment to say Amen in the comments. May God bless all who have known the love of a faithful dog, and may He guide those still searching for their way home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, healing, and divine timing. Comment Amen below. If you believe God works in mysterious, beautiful ways,